It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster.
GDP is flatlining, yet inflation now is rising, and your budget measures mean that it could take longer to get back down to target. Was this all part of the economic plan?
So we recognise the challenges that families remain under and are taking action to address that ongoing cost of living challenge.
If you were flying a plane and there were so many dials in the red, you'd be looking for the parachutes. Now, fortunately for farmers, pensioners and businesses, there are no parachutes.
Inflation is up again for the second month in a row. Is the government's economic plan working? Also today, in opposition, Keir Starmer campaigned for compensation for women affected by changes to the state pension. Now he says this.
I have to take into account whether it's right at the moment to impose further burden on the taxpayer.
Nigel Farage talks money with the richest man in the world. What is Elon Musk up to? And the final Prime Minister's questions of the year. We'll have that live from midday. Joining us today, Labour MP Jo Powell, Conservative peer and Times columnist Daniel Finkelstein, Liberal Democrat Deputy Leader Daisy Cooper and political editor of The Sun on Sunday, Kate Ferguson. This is Politics Live. Let's start with this headline in The Sun. Going wild, Starmer risks fresh crony row by appointing 30 new Labour peers to the House of Lords, including former right-hand woman Sue Gray. Of course, in the manifesto during the election, Labour said it was going to modernise the House of Lords. It said the second chamber of Parliament had become too big. So my opening question to the panel, starting with you, Jo, is it a good look?
Well, as you know, we're abolishing the hereditary peers, so that will bring down the numbers, and we're improving the quality of appointments. So one of the challenges we had in the past was lots of appointments that caused a lot of controversy, people that would not have passed, I think, our standards. And the Conservatives obviously have a lot more peers than Labour do in the House of Lords, so it's up to the Prime Minister to make these appointments, and I'm sure they'll be high quality. So
there's a pragmatic reason, of course, as well, in order to get legislation through. But is it a good look, Danny?
Well, I think it would be an epic failure of sort of personal knowledge and self-awareness to complain about someone else getting a peerage and saying that it was a bad look. My view is that a government shouldn't try and get itself a stable majority in the House of Lords. The whole point is, I think that the crossbench peers ought to have, the sort of the balance in the House of Lords in order that the legislation has a degree of kind of jeopardy as it goes through the House. That's a sensible position. So I don't think they need as many as 30, but I certainly don't object to the names I've seen.
Right. What do you think? Is it a good look? I mean, the numbers are 273 Conservatives, 187 Labour, 184 crossbenchers, 78 Liberal Democrats. Is it a good look to put more people in the Lords?
I think having an unelected second chamber is itself a very bad look. I think all of this is just tinkering around the edges. What we need is a complete overhaul, and we need an elected second chamber.
Right. Is it a good look, Kate?
No, I mean, it's not a good look. Their campaign saying they're going to slim down the House of Lords and make things more transparent. And then at the first opportunity, they're obviously stuffing it with his allies. It makes sense, right, because he wants to get legislation through Parliament and he wants to get it through a tricky House of Lords. But it speaks to that kind of Keir hypocrisy.
Well, 'twas ever thus, I suppose, as you said. Do you think there really will ever be reform in the ways that either this Labour government or previous Conservative governments have talked about?
I mean, I totally understand Daisy's point. I understand the argument for it. The reason why the House of Commons has never done that is because if we do it, we'll end up either with a House of Lords that always agrees with the government or a House of Lords that never agrees with the government. And the moment we do this, we'll then spend the next century regressing that we've done it. We ought to have a weak House of Lords that scrutinises legislation, but moving towards a fully elected chamber really risks complete gridlock.
Jo?
Well, we want to modernise the House of Lords, so that's why we started with the hereditaries, and we've said there will be further reforms later in this Parliament, for example, age limits, So there are ways in which we can bring down the number. I absolutely want to see a House of Lords that is more reflective of modern Britain, that has the sort of different balance of opinions, and the regional element I think could be a really interesting angle to bring in some of those devolved parliaments.
Let's talk about the economy. You saw in the headlines there, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, being asked broadly about the economy, and that's on the back of this headline about the UK inflation rate, which has gone up again from 2.3% to 2.6%, hits its highest level for 8 months. And we're also waiting for the Bank of England to make its decision tomorrow on interest rates. But broadly speaking, Jo, does that worry you? The rate of inflation is going in the wrong direction. Prices are going up.
Well, there has been a small increase in inflation. At the same time, we've now got the fastest growth in wages that we've had for 3 years. Obviously, the Chancellor gave a £1,400 rise in the national minimum wage. So we're trying to protect household incomes, because obviously if your income is going up, that helps. And there are measures in the budget that will bring down inflation in the long term. For example, the Warm Homes Plan to get more insulation into homes and bring bills down. But these things will take a bit of time to come in. But the most important thing is household incomes and protecting people's disposable income.
Do you agree? I mean, Danny, if the rate of inflation, if prices are increasing at a faster rate than they were, what's causing it, do you think?
It's difficult to be sure. I certainly think that it hasn't helped to have a very large tax rising budget, but mostly these are underlying.
Although has that fed through yet, really?
Yeah, mostly these are underlying problems that aren't really to do with with specific government policies. It's too early to say the government's economic policy isn't working. It's not too early to say. I personally think it's unlikely to work. I think if you want to float better public services off increased growth, then if you put up taxes a lot, particularly on business, you're unlikely to get that increased growth. And the budget doesn't predict that we will do, because every calculation modelled on the budget suggests that. So I don't think they're making the right economic decisions.
Should they reverse them in the way we heard in the headlines from the Shadow Chief Secretary?
They have to decide that for themselves. They did get elected saying, we're going to pay for increased public services out of the proceeds of growth. And that's not now what they've done. What they're doing is paying for it out of the proceeds of increased taxation. So it wasn't what they promised to do at the general election. And I think had they promised to do it at the general election, their majority wouldn't have been as great. So it's reasonable, I think, for the Conservatives now to point that out. But it would be too early to say it certainly wouldn't work. It's a punt. I don't think it will.
Of course, the economic inheritance was worse than we expected, as has been laid out clearly. But the other thing about the growth forecast, which has not yet been factored in, is all the reforms we're doing to planning that I think will be a big growth stimulus.
That is going to take quite some time, isn't it? And if we see people's pockets being hit by prices going in the wrong direction or going up at a faster rate than they had been, that is going to be a problem.
One of the biggest inflationary items, if you look at the analysis, has been rents and house prices. So bringing those down in the long term, as with insulation and energy bills, will pay off. And I think ultimately that's the difference. This government is looking much longer term than individual forecasts.
Is growth the right core mission, do you think, for the government? Or should it be more around cost of living?
Well, you need to have both. We do need to get the economy growing again, but fundamentally, people need to feel a difference in their everyday lives. And I do think that whilst the government has got a terrible economic inheritance from the previous Conservative government, they're taking some of the wrong choices. They're making mistakes. It was absolutely the wrong thing to do to cut the winter fuel payment and to push around 2 million vulnerable pensioners, to the brink of not being able to put their heating on. And the national insurance contribution rise as well is going to suppress wages and reduce opportunities for people as well. And I think those are two very worrying
If you don't
measures.
do either of those things, what do you do then? I mean, I was sympathetic to what the government did on the winter fuel payments, just because, although I think they shouldn't have given in to the train drivers, and that was a mistake and cost them more money, but just because I think they've got a lot of very difficult decisions to make on public finances. So it's all very well to say.
Well, on winter fuel payment, everyone knows there are a lot of wealthier pensioners who don't need the winter fuel payment.
So are you in favour of means testing?
Well, I think there are other options on the table. So they could have kept it a universal benefit but made it taxable. They could raise the pension credit limit, but it's not going to save the government money, because if their drive to get people onto pension credit is successful, it will cost the same amount, if not more. So it's actually not a cost-saving measure, but it's been done in such a crude, haphazard way that there are 2 million pensioners who are being pushed into a very vulnerable position. So there are alternative ways they could have tackled that issue.
Okay.
Should Labour be worried about the state of play 6 months in, as we are now? Or is it too early to make a judgment in terms of the economy?
I actually think they should be worried, because I think it's been a very brief political honeymoon. And part of the reason it's been a brief political honeymoon is because they went off and did lots of things they didn't campaign on. So they went and whacked up taxes massively while studiously alluding to that in the manifesto and in the campaign. In the campaign, in the manifesto, it was all about growth. Now that mission's been quietly, or not so quietly, dropped, and we're not seeing any growth. It feels like every other week Rachel Reeves is off doing one of these awkward GDP figures down, or inflation's up, one of these awkward morning rounds. And I mean, if they don't turn the economy around, make people feel a bit better, get some growth in the economy, then they will be in trouble at the next election. That is true of all governments, all political parties.
I think absolutely. Household incomes is the critical metric here, and we've had the fastest wage growth we've had for 3 years. So that's approximately £20 extra per week on average across the country. That is more money in people's pockets. And when you look at the
train drivers had more than that, of course.
When you look at the long-term growth that this country needs, is things like public investment in housing, in infrastructure, in hospitals, it's insulation, it's the energy transition, and those are all the decisions we've taken in the first few months. Now, of course, those take time to play through into the real economy, but that's why you have to have a long-term strategy while at the same time trying to protect wages in the short term.
I think one of the problems with the government's approach on this is they're putting all of their sort of growth eggs in the building stuff basket, and it's going to take a very long time to start building everything the government wants to build, whether that's infrastructure or houses. And the national insurance contribution rise actually undermines some of the growth we could have had far more quickly from small businesses and high streets and all those kind of...
I think the majority, Labour's got a right to put in place what it thinks is the right way to increase growth. I just doubt that it's going to produce the growth you think it will. I think that taxing business in the way that you have, you can see this in the budget. I mean, the budget itself is not predicting that it will grow. So, you know, I understand the argument. We've got to wait for it to work, but I just don't share your faith that it will.
Well, in the meantime, there was a decision by the government yesterday, by Liz Kendall, the Work and Pensions Secretary of State, to say that they're not going to pay compensation to WASPI women, and they are the Women Against State Pension Inequality. Take a look at some of the front pages of today's papers. If you have a look at the Mirror, we have been betrayed. Another front page is the Daily Mail. Betrayal that proves Labour cynically said anything to get elected. And finally, in the Times, Labour MPs rebel over new blow to pensioners. As I said, the campaign group refers to Women Against State Pension Inequality. It represents women born in the 1950s who were affected by the equalisation of the state pension age, changing it from 60 to 65 in a bid to match up with men. Now, WASPI campaign group agrees with the equalisation, but says that the affected women were not given sufficient warning and should be compensated. Jo, in opposition, your party, including dozens of the current cabinet, we can see here Keir Starmer, photographed with WASPI women. In that, it says, "I support fair and fast compensation for 1950s women." Why have you broken your promise now you're in government?
Well, there was no commitment to this in the manifesto at the last election, and I think it's really important to be clear about the specifics of this issue. The WASPI campaign was launched after the coalition government, a Lib Dem pension minister and George Osborne, accelerated the transition in terms of the age.
5 million letters were sent out during coalition, so there was no maladministration during coalition years.
Let me finish the point. The WASPI campaign was launched after that because people were unhappy with that rapid increase. The specific investigation by the Ombudsman, as the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions made clear, referred to a communication issue in the mid-2000s for which the government has apologised.
But the Ombudsman did say and suggest and recommend compensation of between £1,000 and £2,950.
The Ombudsman had no suggestion of a bespoke compensation scheme that could actually be delivered given the scale of the number of people in that bracket.
But Jo, when you look at all the pictures, we've just seen a variety of now members of the cabinet standing with WASPI women from that campaign. It's the level of hypocrisy, I think, that people are talking about, where they might understand the reasons for not going ahead, but why did you stand there with all these women, implying that you would do something?
In the 2019 manifesto, and people may remember with long memories in that election, the commitment was there, and we lost that election. Subsequently, in the 2024 manifesto, we did not have that commitment. So we will absolutely need to learn the lessons about communication of changes of the state pension aid from the DWP. And I think the Minister was very clear about that yesterday, because people should get that information in time to plan.
Right, that image of Keir Starmer there is from 2022, so that's later than you're talking about. Do you understand WASPI women's anger?
Absolutely, and of course I have total empathy for people who were not aware that the state age pension had changed, and we need to learn the lessons about the communication. But I do agree with the Minister's position that to make a financial scheme in this is not the right move.
£10.5 billion, should they be compensated to that amount?
I don't think so. And so I feel really let down, but not by the thing that everyone is feeling today. I feel really let down because it was very hard making the argument against, people for whom one has naturally a lot of human sympathy, that this wasn't a reasonable thing for the rest of us to pay. In my opinion, people were given quite a lot of notice, and people have to make their own financial provisions in the light of what's happening, and we all knew what was happening. So I didn't agree with what the Ombudsman finding was, and it was very difficult to resist it. So I feel quite let down by people appearing with a lot of posters. And I mean, Daisy will know how angry people get when people appear with these posters and then don't live by it, but living by it is completely impossible. So I was quite disappointed to find yesterday that Ed Davey was saying we should be paying this, because if he was in government, he wouldn't be able to do it either, just like Labour has found it. And we've got to get to a position where oppositions are stronger about this sort of thing.
Right, so lessons learned. I mean, is it reminiscent of the tuition fees debacle?
No, look, these things are separate. This is a historic injustice that has gone back for years and years and years, and politicians of all political persuasions have said that they would support the WASPI women.
I don't think the government said it would compensate to the tune of £10.5 billion.
This is a historic injustice. The Ombudsman has looked into this issue. We as a Liberal Democrat said that we would respect what the Ombudsman said. And I think there's a bit of a danger with what Danny's saying. I mean, we can argue about the strength of opposition or otherwise, but if we set a precedence of ignoring an independent report from an Ombudsman, that poses quite a lot of danger for future
how would you pay
historic injustices.
How would you pay for £10.5 billion of compensation?
Well, there were different recommendations in the Ombudsman's report.
Well, let's just take £10.5 billion.
Some are between 3 and 10 billion. But as with all historic injustices, that money, as I understand it, is normally paid for from borrowing, as it has been for the infected blood scandal and other scandals as well.
All right, so you would add to borrowing.
Well, 3 billion on top of what is already £100 billion in terms of government borrowing. But this is to pay a historic injustice. And I think yesterday really was a day of real shame.
Is there a rebellion brewing on this?
There is a rebellion brewing on the Labour backbenchers. Maybe you'll be able to tell us a bit about it. But, I mean, it's amazing, really. Lots of Labour MPs are absolutely furious about this, because they went off and posed with their local WASPI women, and they put it all over their websites, and they campaigned speaking to those women, saying they'd support their campaign. So a lot of them feel betrayed by their own leader as well, and they've got their local voters and supporters to manage. I see that a colleague of yours is already tweeting out angry letters to Liz Kendall, which is only a few months into a majority government, so it's quite quick, really.
Jo?
Well, I respectfully disagree with those colleagues. I think it was the right decision yesterday, and it was the responsible decision. And again, I don't think the decision, and Liz Kendall was clear about this, this is not primarily about the money. It is about the principle of the decision, and the government has the right to disagree with an ombudsman, and they have accepted lots of other recommendations about communication. But I think, again, we have to be really clear. A lot of the anger around the pace of change of increasing the state age pension, which was a Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition decision in 2011, we opposed that at the time. We didn't think it should go as quickly as it did.
But don't you
take some responsibility, Daisy? You talk about the numbers of letters that went out. If that was the case, more people would have known about it. And it was something that you did speed up to that transition when the Lib Dems were in government.
The Ombudsman was really clear. The maladministration happened under the last Labour government, and they've also pointed the finger at the most recent Conservative government, which didn't do enough about it. During coalition years, 5 million letters were sent out to people being affected by changes in the state pension age, and we Liberal Democrats were instrumental during coalition in introducing the triple lock and the new state pension as well.
So
Danny?
People aren't asking Liz Kendall to pay for this personally. They're asking for all of us to pay for it. And the question is whether or not, on top of all the other things that we're paying for, this is a reasonable demand. And the government, I'm glad the government's made the decision. They don't think it is, because it has to come out of something else, right? If we borrow for that, we can't borrow for other things. And we also have to pay, the interest on the loan. And I don't think we should for this, right? I can see the injustice and I understand the case for it, but this is a lot of money, and people were told a long time ago that their pension age was going to be equalised, and it's reasonable for them to make allowances for that in their finances. And so to expect everyone else to pay for that, it's not as though this is talking about the government and its personal generosity. This is about whether, as a collective, that's something that we want to do. And I'm glad the government's made the decision that it isn't. I think it was unreasonable of them, however, to campaign giving people the impression that they would do something that they were never going to want to do.
All I would say is I've met WASPI women in St Albans, my own constituency. I've met WASPI women in Parliament. I've met WASPI women at Liberal Democrat autumn conferences as well. And there are some really terrible stories of women who've been pushed into real poverty, women who have been living in sort of spare rooms with their adult children because of decisions that they made. It may be, as the Ombudsman says, that not everybody was poorly affected, but there are some WASPI women who were very badly affected. This is a historic injustice. And as we're seeing time and time again, there are these historic injustices, and they have to be put right.
Is there much Conservative opposition in terms of criticising the government for not paying this compensation? Other than levelling the accusation of hypocrisy, they themselves probably broadly agree with Danny.
Yeah, I think that where Labour are most vulnerable here is that hypocrisy line. So that's going to be what you see Tories plug away at. I remember when Labour campaigned on this in the old election, and when John McDonnell kind of signed them up to commit to it, I think just at a kind of fringe event one day. But the point is, under Keir Starmer's leadership, when it was his decision, he carried on campaigning for it. And it leaves Labour really open to this criticism they get time and again, which is you campaigned on one thing and you're doing the total opposite in government.
Well, let me just show the image again of the Prime Minister, wasn't Prime Minister then, with two campaigners. We'll be talking to one of them after Prime Minister's questions. Now, yesterday, Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, made headlines again after meeting with Reform UK leader Nigel Farage and now Reform UK Treasury property tycoon Nick Candy. Musk ready to bankroll Farage with biggest donation in British political history. So he's since endorsed Reform UK, that's Elon Musk, with speculation growing that he will make a huge donation to the party. But let's talk about Elon Musk in terms of some of his interference, as certainly people in Labour believe, with his tweets over the summer warning of a civil war when there was all that unrest, and talk to Mike Wendling, the BBC's US national digital reporter. Hello to you, Mike. What's eating Elon Musk when it comes to the UK?
It seems that, judging by his tweets, and, that's kind of all we have to go on, Musk thinks that Britain is somewhere between a police state and a Stalinist nightmare. He's been regularly criticizing the UK government and the political establishment. You laid out in your intro kind of his positioning there. And I think that he's really genuinely concerned about free speech in Britain, and he expresses that regularly online. Of course, there's other factors at play, his own ideology and his own pushing of a particularly American view of free speech.
Do you think he's serious about Reform UK?
the people I spoke to, I was looking into this for a radio documentary recently. They were skeptical of the reports about the scale of his financial contribution. We've seen huge sums being sort of batted around. On the other hand, here in the United States, there was similar skepticism when he got involved in American politics in the same way over the summer. And it turns out that in various ways, he did contribute about $250 million to trying to get Donald Trump reelected. So at the moment, it's pretty unclear, but it is very clear that if he's going to pick in the UK, it'll be Reform UK, it'll be Nigel Farage, and he could choose to get involved in a very big way.
Mike Wendling, thank you very much. I'm going to leave it there because the line to you is a little bit unstable. We can show you the picture here that has been broadcast this week, and you can see there Elon Musk in the middle with Nick Candy and Nigel Farage under a very flattering picture there of Donald Trump. Well, what influence could this have in UK politics? Let's talk to Rupert Lowe, Reform UK MP for Great Yarmouth. Hello to you. Are you expecting a big windfall donation from Elon Musk, Rupert?
No, Jo. I've seen the pictures like you. I very much admire Elon Musk. I admire his libertarianism. I admire what he's done at Twitter. And I sincerely hope that he will contribute to reforming British politics through reform. That's what I'd like to see. It's happened with other parties in the past. The momentum is with us now. We've got lots of donors, not just Elon Musk, who want to come forward and help the party. I think they can see that the sort of sclerotic two-party politics that has predominated in Britain really since the war is coming to an end,
right,
and
so
there is a need for a disruptor,
right?
And that's what's happening.
I missed what you said at the very beginning. Did you say you would welcome a big donation from Elon Musk?
I very much would welcome.
Yes, so
I very much would welcome a big donation.
Yes, you're the party though of national sovereignty. I do remember Nigel Farage in the past saying that he used to warn against accepting foreign money into UK politics. What's changed?
Well, I think America very often, Jo, leads the way. They unfortunately led the way with sort of wokery and a lot of the other things that have damaged our societies so much. And now they seem to be leading the way in reforming themselves. Donald Trump, I think it's his second term. He's ready to go. I think he knows his way around now. And I think the Anglo-Saxon sort of world needs to wake up and needs to work together to return free speech, to return freedom of the individual, and promote the individual versus the state.
All right. Well, let's bring. All right. Well, let's bring in. Let me bring in our other guests here. First of all, on donations, it's obviously illegal to accept a foreign donation, but there are ways that Elon Musk could make that donation through X.
Parties have done it, Jo.
Yes, well, hang on, I'm just talking to the guests here in the studio, but we'll come back to you. If Musk did decide to make a donation, would you try and block it?
Well, it is illegal for an individual to make a donation, and I'm frankly staggered by Rupert's opening comment there. In fact, in the US, you also can't give foreign I can't donate to US politics, so their rules are also clear on this. So what I think we need to do is look at some of the loopholes. This is not just about Elon Musk. This is about, in general, hostile state actors interfering with our democracy. So I would like to see, for example, the loophole closed on subsidiaries of foreign companies, maybe have a cap on that they could only donate the amount of profit they make in the UK, for example, so that you can ensure that they don't abuse and subvert the system.
Right. Rupert?
Well, look, I mean, other parties have had overseas donations, Jo. As I say, we have to do it legally. You're quite right, it can't be done directly, but there are things that reform needs to do, which we're working on now, such as policy think tanks and other mechanisms through which people can donate to effectively move forward the cause of reform. And that's,
I think what you're describing
we're working on
is a
doing.
Subversion of the intent of the law. And we actually need to go back to what the original, when the Committee of Standards of Public Life laid this out, that foreign donors should not be able to use companies or any other unincorporated association or think tank or any of those other things you just described to subvert the rule on foreign donations. And the Electoral Commission, I believe, need more powers to prevent exactly what you're describing.
Rupert?
Well, you just don't like the fact that reform is now moving up in the polls. In the past, this is exactly what's been done by Tories and the Labour Party through think tanks. So it's pretty rich to now come out, and now that the British public can see that change is necessary, it's like a bad loser coming out now saying that shouldn't happen.
Well, Danny Finkelstein is here to...
If Elon Musk was German and he was giving his money to the Labour Party, reform would be completely opposed to it, and you know that. And I don't think we should make laws specifically about one person and one person's donation. I think that's a very bad principle.
That's not what I'm saying.
I think that would be a very bad principle. Nor do I think, actually, that his donation will necessarily be a game changer for reform, because I think the game is already changing and the reform is, establishing itself as a serious political force that other people are going to have arguments with. My main problem with Elon Musk is not his money or the fact that he's American. I just think he's wrong. The changes he's made to X have certainly opened it up to a lot of free speech, but if you're on X, it's quite intimidating if you happen, for example, to be Jewish, to be on his platform. And so his completely unnuanced view of free speech is, in my view, reckless. So I have real political disagreements, but I'm willing to have them out with him. I wouldn't want to create a special law that banned him. However, I'm very surprised that you are so insouciant, Rupert, about accepting donations from a foreigner for clearly a foreign view of British politics, right? And you certainly wouldn't do it if he was German or French and he wasn't proposing to donate to reform.
Right, is that true, Rupert?
Danny, as you know, the free speech is embedded in the 1689 Declaration of Rights. It's absolutely essential in Parliament and it's essential in the country. So I totally support free speech.
Yeah, but what about the point about accepting a donation from Germany?
I was using it as an example of that. I was using it to make a point to you, which you could reply to.
I'm fully in Elon Musk's camp on free speech, Danny. I think curbing free speech is extremely dangerous.
Point? If he was French or German and he was donating to the Labour Party, would you be in favour of allowing that to happen?
Look, he's one person who's talking about helping the
Yeah,
reform
but Rupert, answer that specific question. No, because I've asked it. I've asked it at the beginning about.
Let me finish.
I'm going to finish my question, and then you can finish your answer.
We've got other donors as well as Elon Musk, who are very much legally can donate to the party, both in terms of money and in terms of policy help, which is what we need. We need
Rupert, but what about my
based
question?
On common sense.
What about my question?
Would you
because that was also in the 1689 document, as far as I remember. It also said that you had to answer my question. So, I would like to know, if he was German or French and donating to the Labour Party, what would your attitude to that be?
Danny, you well know that both the Tories and Labour have had donations from people.
You were against that,
from
so
overseas.
would you be in favour of it?
You know that, and now the boot's on the other foot, you don't like it. So
I have to give up. No, I don't like it.
It's got to be done. As long as
I'm
it's
asking
done
you whether
legally,
you like
I'm delighted with it. As long as it's done legally, it's absolutely fine.
And if it is done legally, you wouldn't object, Daisy?
No, well, look, when it comes to free speech, free speech has always been about people without a voice speaking truth to power. It has never been about billionaires buying up social media platforms and saying what they like with impunity. That is not free speech. That is the rich and powerful getting away with whatever they want to do. This particular point on donations, though, this is a long-standing issue. This is not new. Right? Reform are going to claim, because as night follows day, they'll claim it's a stitch-up and it's the establishment and blah, blah, blah. This is not a new issue. It doesn't matter whether it's Elon Musk or somebody else, and Danny's absolutely right on this. Whether it's Elon Musk or somebody else, if you ask the British people, do you want foreign billionaires to be able to give hundreds of millions of pounds to any political party in this country to change your mind and to influence elections through an organisation, even when they were not permitted to make that donation themselves? I think the British public would say no. And on that basis, we need to get on with legislating to clean up politics and clean up the dirty money and the unknown money in our politics more broadly.
Your thoughts on this, Kate? In terms of Elon Musk and a donation,
Well, my thoughts are a pretty basic one, really, which is I think if Elon writes this cheque we're all talking heatedly about to Nigel Farage, I think it would be a game changer. I mean, Danny's right. The game is already changing. They've got 4 million votes. They are growing in membership and they are kind of thrusting themselves onto that mainstream political stage. But what Reform and the different iteration of Nigel Farage's different parties has always struggled with is the kind of bread and butter ground game, employing people locally to build up branch structures and then use that to catapult them thrust themselves into the front two of politics. And that's what this cheque could do. If they get it or not, if it's of the scale we're talking about, who knows. More broadly, I think we're going to see a lot of Nigel over the next few years make a lot of his broader relationship with Elon and Donald Trump beyond the money.
Right. Well, Rupert, I'm going to try again because we still haven't had an answer from you. If it was a German or a French billionaire donating to the Labour Party, would you object?
Bang on this point, Joe. I've told you, as long as the money is donated legally,
you wouldn't
I'm
object.
delighted. And as Danny says, the game is changing. Reform, we're getting UK donors who want to come in and help with money and with policy. But in response to Daisy's point about Elon Musk and Twitter, donors. I would ask you, what is the BBC? It's a state monopoly pumping out state cant. It's no different.
Right. Well,
it's
of course,
a monopoly.
I would disagree on that with you most vociferously. But Rupert, there is another.
It's an establishment monopoly, Joe. It's nothing else. You know that.
It's a public broadcaster. This is regulated by Ofcom. That's very different from having social media platforms.
Yes.
We're on it now, Rupert.
What a regulator Ofcom is, Daisy. What a regulator they are.
But how many times have you been on the programme in recent weeks, Rupert?
In which programme? Your programme?
Yes.
I appeared on your programme the other day live. You've chosen to put me on Zoom this week, which is fine.
You've been on at least twice, so I don't think you can say you've been on. Can I just get back to the point about,
That's not the point.
your
it's still
association?
A monopoly, Joe.
Hang on, Rupert. The association that you think is going to be so advantageous because the polling that has been done suggests that Donald Trump isn't popular in the UK. So is there a fear, with Elon Musk being part of the Trump team, that actually it could be damaging for Reform UK rather than enhancing it?
You asking me?
Yes.
No, I think people want change, and they see very refreshing things happening in the USA. And I think the Department of Government Efficiency is what we require here.
But the polling doesn't suggest that.
We've got too much state and not enough private sector. Oh. And until we address that, we'll go on. Our economy will go on basically grinding into dust.
Well, yesterday, Tim Montgomery, who has joined Reform UK, said that the best way to keep Keir Starmer and the Labour government out or from winning next time is to merge with the Conservatives. Do you agree with that?
Didn't really have an opinion on that. I mean,
really?
As George Galloway said, they're two cheeks of the same backside. So arguably, if you follow that logic, then maybe. But I don't think that's likely to happen.
Well, it's not about whether it's likely. I'm asking you if you would like it to happen and you think that is the best way.
It's not for me, Daisy. I'm just doing my job trying to transparently... Sorry, Joe. I'm just trying to do my job transparently, exposing what's happening by asking my 20 questions and then feeding the transparent answers back to the British public. They can make their own minds up.
All right.
I think they know the country is not being governed well, and what they need is the facts and the data to be able to make that judgment for themselves. I'm not trying to tell people what they should or shouldn't do. I'm not really interested in that.
Joe?
Well, I just want to pull this back to the key point, which is, as we've been discussing with the Chinese spy situation and with other people trying to influence our democracy from outside, that is the principle that I am strongly against. And foreign donations are currently illegal from an individual. And I believe this is not just about reform. It's not about one donation. This has been a problem, I agree with Daisy, for years. And now is the time for Parliament to look at protecting our democracy from dirty money from outside the country.
What should be should there be a cap on donations?
I'm not in favour of changing the rules of political donations in this country in any way in response to a newspaper story about one person giving money to a political party I don't agree with. I think that would be fundamentally the wrong thing to do.
But it was in the Labour manifesto and it was in the Liberal Democrat manifesto. So this is not about it's not about responding to this. It's actually about pursuing what all parties said in their manifestos.
But Danny, that's why it's a wider point. Transparency International studied donations in this country for the last 2 decades, and they found 1 in £10 came from a source we don't know of. We don't know who gave that money because they gave it through one of these organisations that Rupert's talking about. Now, I think we should have transparency.
We know Elon Musk is not dirty money. He's probably the most eminent entrepreneur who's built the most fantastic series of
Rupert.
businesses.
I'll give you a word in just a second.
To liken him to dirty money launderers is quite extraordinary.
He can't give this money, obviously,
No.
so that's against the rules. So it isn't his money. So the question is whether or not Twitter in this country or X in this country can give that money. And I would not be in favour of banning them from doing it just because I don't agree with reform, nor do I, as it happens, think the crucial thing to reform's growth is whether or not they get or do not get whatever is going to come to them from Twitter in this country. What will affect whether they rise is whether or not there's economic satisfaction in this country, whether, in the earlier conversation we had, whether this country grows. I don't happen to... It's a respectful disagreement I have with you, Rupert. I don't happen to think that either the proposals you made for on free speech, however strongly I support free speech, which I do, I think what Elon Musk has done with X has been a mistake generally. I don't agree with you about the BBC, and I think you'll find it much more difficult to impose what he says he's going to do through this Department of Government Efficiency in this country than you think. But nevertheless, those are reasonable arguments. Reasonable arguments between intelligent people, and we can have them.
All right, Rupert Lowe, final comment from you.
I find it extraordinary that Danny can disagree with my view that the BBC is a monopoly. It's a state-funded monopoly funded by a compulsory...
We're going to talk about reform, and he didn't.
It's a monopoly, obviously.
No, it isn't.
Because there's like...
Of course it's a monopoly. It's a media monopoly.
There's newspapers, there's GB News,
there is
there's
a proliferation
Sky.
in terms of broadcasters. But Rupert Lowe, thank you very much. It's almost time
pleasure.
for PMQs. We could pop into the chamber. It's filling up nicely. It is the final Prime Minister's questions before the end of the term, and MPs go off for recess. Danny, if you can wind back a little in history, of course, you were political advisor to an opposition leader, William Hague. How do you think Kemi Badenoch is doing?
I think my criticism... I think she's got quite a good freshness to style, often is pretty good in the exchanges. My criticism, sometimes I wonder about the choice of question. I would be sticking very much to these bread and butter issues, and sometimes she doesn't do that, and I think that's, for example, I think starting off with questions about Donald Trump was an odd one. So I've sometimes been a bit questioning about the subjects, but her ability at doing it, no, I don't question that. I think she's been quite good at doing it.
What's your view of the view of Conservative MPs, many of whom, of course, supported her? Have they given a sort of score, rate card so far?
I think they'll probably give her a bit longer, and quite right too. She has only just got that leadership, and the idea of already talking about change of leader would be kind of mad. I think the thing is with Kemi is she can be super fresh, quite kind of bombastic, quite engaging. However, she can also be a little bit submarine. So we don't always see her much in between the PMQs. And I think in this new, much more fractious political world, when you've got Nigel barging you one way, Labour the other, you have to kind of do more to grab attention and win over the public each week, each day, each month. And I think that's where she falters, personally.
What have you made of her so far?
Well, it's interesting because she can't actually ask any questions on the bread and butter issues because the Conservative Party's fingerprints are all over those issues. So she's doing kind of classic Kemi in going for the kind of the culture war stuff, I think she's quite tetchy. She's quite sensitive. I think some of her Conservative colleagues on the backbenches are quite quiet, and certainly what they sort of say to me is, we'll keep going for now, and in a couple of years we'll change our leader again. Certainly what they're saying quietly behind the backbenches.
Do you think she will be leader into the next election, Danny?
Yes. Yeah, I mean that would be my judgment. I think it's unlikely, and I also happen to think it would be calamitous for the Conservative Party to consider that, and it's certainly calamitous if people are saying that. And I must admit, I don't obviously talk to the same people that you do. I don't think that is a widespread thing being said, but I think if anyone who is saying that, I think that's fundamentally unwise at this point, because the Conservative Party lost a lot of support because it was so incoherent and disloyal, and if it did that again, it wouldn't deserve support, let alone get it.
And just before I come to you, Jo, you can now listen to Politics Live on the live news stream on BBC Sounds. Just go to the live dial at the top of the BBC Sounds homepage and tap on Live News. You can see all the details there. The Prime Minister's been away a lot this term. He's just come back from Norway and Estonia in time for PMQs. Has he been away too much? Should he be grounded here a bit more?
One of the most staggering for me arguments that have been made in the chamber by Kemi Badenoch was that the Prime Minister should somehow not be fulfilling his duty on the international stage by going to summits and meeting with other world leaders. It's an essential part of the job. He was just in Estonia, including meeting with British troops there. So obviously he has to balance the two. But he's a new Prime Minister. He wants to meet his counterparts on the world stage, and that's absolutely the right thing to do. And in terms of what might come up today, I really would like him to bring up the leader of the opposition floating this idea of a flat tax, because when you talk about tax, that'll be a massive tax rise for average workers in this country and a big pay cut for big earners. So if she's floating ideas like that, that shows that she's not really on the side of increasing household incomes where we started this programme.
I mean, is this the time to talk about the ideas like that? I mean, she said it wouldn't be the right time and so on and so forth, or not?
I think suggesting you're going to introduce a flat tax is like standing up with a poster saying you're going to compensate WASPI women. When you get into power, or tuition fees, when you get into power, you won't be able to do that.
Right. I mean, it is the dangers of opposition, as you know and found out when you were part of the coalition. It's easy to say things in opposition. They can come back to haunt you.
Well, there are lots of things that we said going into the general election, which we're still saying now, which is that we want the government to focus on the NHS and social care.
But you are still in opposition.
Yeah. But we are. But we're being a constructive opposition and setting out suggestions as to how the government could raise funds in a fairer way. So rather, where the Conservatives are just attacking for attacking's sake, we are trying to be a constructive opposition and give the government ideas as to where they could look to raise revenue.
Something you're going to look at and take on board, the suggestions from the Liberal Democrats?
Well, whenever there's, pragmatic, good, common sense suggestions that we can work together on, and I think on social care and carers and so on, there's lots of common ground we can work together on. I think the British public would like to see that.
One of the curious things last week was Kemi Badenoch's decision to focus on immigration, an area that the Conservatives, by their own measure, didn't deliver on, Kate.
Yeah, exactly. You could too late.
PMQs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday I met the brave men and women serving on HMS Iron Duke and the troops serving in Operation Kabarit in Estonia. This Christmas, as every Christmas, members of our armed forces will be serving overseas, working day and night to protect Britain's national security. And I know that the whole House will join me in sending our deepest thanks to them, to our emergency services and everyone working to keep the country safe over the festive period. Mr. Speaker, may I also take this opportunity at the end of the year to thank you and the House staff for all your hard work this year. And can I wish everyone across the House a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Recently. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I associate myself with the Prime Minister's remarks. In 2021, Kerry and Francis Menai Davis, who live in my constituency of North East Hertfordshire and are in the gallery here today, tragically lost their son Hugh at the age of just 6 to a rare form of cancer. Now they are courageously campaigning to ensure that every parent who must leave work to look after a sick child in hospital gets the financial support that they need from day one. Will the Prime Minister meet with them and me to discuss implementing Hugh's law and giving their son a legacy that improves the lives of families at the most difficult time imaginable?
Mr. Speaker, can I pay tribute to Kerry and Francis? It is a heartbreaking case and commend them for their campaign on behalf of other families. I know the Minister for Social Security and Disability met the family yesterday, but no parent should endure losing their child to cancer, particularly at such a young age. We are investing £1.5 billion for new surgical hubs and scanners, £70 million for new radiotherapy machines, and we will set out our next steps on the Children and Young People Cancer Task Force shortly.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, can I send my warmest wishes to our armed forces at home and overseas, to the emergency services and everyone who will be working over Christmas. And can I wish you, Mr. Speaker, the House staff and all members of this House a very Merry Christmas. Mr. Speaker, for years, the Prime Minister and his cabinet played politics with the WASPI women. The Deputy Prime Minister said Conservatives were stealing their pensions. She promised to compensate them in full. Another broken promise. Now they admit we were right all along. But let's ask about another group of pensioners whose trust... Let's ask about another group of pensioners whose trust was broken. Since the Chancellor cut winter fuel payments, how many extra people have applied for pension credit?
Mr. Speaker, the number one job of this government was to put the finances back in order after the last government lost control. They left a £22 billion black hole, and we had to take tough choices. We made sure the most vulnerable pensioners do get the winter fuel payment, and we have been encouraging and driving up eligibility for pension credit, so saying up to their entitlement. And she should join that campaign. But, Mr. Speaker, here's the difference. Because we've stabilised the economy, we can commit to the triple lock. That means that next April, pensioners get another £470. But here's the difference, because 2 weeks ago, the Shadow Chancellor said the triple lock is unsustainable. Their position, so pensioners would lose out under the Tories yet again.
Mr. Speaker, he didn't answer the question because he doesn't know the answer. There are 850,000 eligible pensioners not claiming pension credit. If they sign up, that will cost the Treasury £2.3 billion, wiping out the savings that the Chancellor claimed she would make. Before the election, his Chief Secretary told the public they had no plans to cut winter fuel. But they did have plans, didn't they? Age UK say cutting the winter fuel payment with very little notice will potentially jeopardise the health and finances of millions of older people. Does he agree with Age UK that this is the last thing both pensioners and the NHS need?
Mr. Speaker, we've been driving up with a campaign for pension credit. It's important that everybody who's entitled to it claims that pension credit. And she shouldn't claim as some great victory the record of their government that people haven't signed up. We're the ones with the campaign. They should be supporting it. But because of the triple lock, pensions will be going up by £470 next April. She hasn't answered the question. Her Shadow Chancellor says the triple lock is unsustainable. So she needs to explain how pensioners will be worse off under a Tory government.
It is Prime Minister's question.
Mr. Speaker, we protected the triple lock during all our time in government. Meanwhile, energy bills are increasing, despite his promise to cut them by £300. In Scotland, his party leader wants to restore the winter fuel payments. Across England, councils are scrabbling together funds for struggling pensioners. The tragic reality this Christmas is pensioners will suffer and may even die as a result of this cruel policy. Did the Chancellor consider the impact on councils and on the NHS, or does she just not know what she's doing?
The Household Support Fund was set out in the budget. She knows that. We're pushing up pension credit. But she now says they are committed to the triple lock. Her Shadow Chancellor says they're not, that it's unsustainable. Maybe over a sandwich or a steak they could sort it out and come back and tell us what their policy actually is.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister needs to misrepresent me to make his point. I don't need to misrepresent him to make my point. Yes. The truth is, he didn't think this through. Cutting winter fuel payments isn't just callous. It may not make savings. It could actually cost us all more. And that's not the only policy which is making things worse. The Chancellor's budget is a body blow to family businesses and also charities. Marie Curie have warned that Labour's budget will cost them nearly £3 million a year. This is a cancer charity saying they have no option but to reduce services. Did the Chancellor tell the Prime Minister that her jobs tax was going to hit charities?
Mr. Speaker, she's asked 3 questions about winter fuel with a leaving out. I'll come to that. But she's changed her mind on this. She used to say that the payments were a dead weight. She said there were members of her constituency who didn't need it. And they all stood in 2017 on a manifesto, a Tory manifesto, that committed to getting rid of the universal winter payments for pensioners. So we can see what their real commitment is. As for the budget, we're driving up productivity.
I don't want to have to ring your mother. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're driving up productivity, prosperity and living standards. That's a pay rise for the 3 million who are the lowest paid. They should welcome that. A pay rise for those working in the NHS and better than expected wage growth just before Christmas. What unites all three? Delivered by Labour, opposed by the Tories.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know what world he's living in. The economy is shrinking, and they did not think this jobs tax through or who it would impact. Another area affected is the hospice sector. Hospices believe the budget will cost them an extra £30 million. Yesterday, Conservatives voted to exempt social care, nurseries, charities and hospices from their jobs tax. Labour voted this down. So can the Prime Minister at least agree to fund hospices so they can continue their invaluable work helping people at the end of their lives?
Mr. Speaker, we put a record amount into the NHS in the budget to deal with the problem that they left, and we'll set out the funding arrangements for hospices in the new year. But it's the same old, same old. They want all the benefits. She said to herself she wants all the benefits from the budget, but she doesn't want to pay for any of them. That's what got us into the problem in the first place.
Mr. Speaker, I did not hear a commitment there to help hospices, which is a shame. The truth is, this winter, people will be suffering because of his choices. The economy is shrinking, inflation is going up, and jobs are being lost because of his budget. Pensioners won't be able to heat their homes because of his government's decisions. They raised people's hopes but then smashed them with broken promises. And now we learn that he is about to give away our hard-won Brexit freedoms. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, now we learn he is about to give away our hard-won Brexit freedoms. The truth is, they are punching the British people in the face, literally in the case of one of his MPs, and he will pretend that this is about the past. But we all know these are his choices, bad choices. If he's looking for a New Year's resolution, why doesn't he start with telling the truth?
I'll do it now. £22 billion black hole left by them. Record numbers on the waiting lists. Nearly.
It's not a good time to leave the chamber, is it? Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, £22 billion black hole. Record waiting list with our NHS. They should hang their heads in shame. Immigration completely out of control. Nearly 1 million net migration. She was the cheerleader for all of that. She wants the truth. That's the truth. That's why they're sitting there. Mr. Speaker, whilst they cart from the sidelines, talking the country down, this government is getting on with the job. Record funding for the NHS. Money for our trains, buses, and yes, Mr. Speaker, potholes. Pay rises for 3 million of the lowest paid. Wages growing faster than inflation. Planning laws reform. Great British Energy set up. we're only getting started. Next year we'll continue to rebuild, no matter what the blockers opposite say.
Amanda Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I echo the words of the Prime Minister and thank you and all of our staff in this place alongside our armed forces and our emergency services and wish them a Merry Christmas. Mr. Speaker, March 2025 marks 20 years since the death of the only Member of Parliament to have held all four great offices of state: the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, James Callaghan was a true Portsmouth great and went to the same school as another true Portsmouth great, my dad, Terry Nolan. Does the Prime Minister back my bid for a plaque to be added to his former home in Copner? And will he come along to Portsmouth next year to unveil it?
Well, I thank her for her question. Jim Callaghan was a giant of the Labour movement and a great public servant. Mr. Speaker, he left school at 17, served in our Royal Navy, before becoming the Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, Chancellor, and of course, finally, Prime Minister. And as a proud son of Portsmouth, I'm sure he'd be honoured to be remembered in such a way. Happy Christmas.
Can I just say to Mr. Mayor, I keep hearing, I heard you the other week over here, I'm hearing again that it's not a good time to push a luck today. Right. Let us come to Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Red David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his praise and best wishes for our armed forces and our emergency services? And can I join others in wishing you happy Christmas, Mr. Speaker, and all the staff of the Commons, and indeed everyone across this House. I'm coming to sing in a minute. Mr. Speaker, I've had the great joy of spending time recently with some amazing young people from the Bath Philharmonia Young Carers Choir. They're a brilliant example of the power of music to make a difference in young people's lives. One member of the choir, Caitlin, has even developed a special new project to spread the joy of music to young people in our schools and communities. So will the Prime Minister meet Caitlin to hear more about her exciting project and work with us and others to support music in our schools and communities?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I welcome his comments, and as you will know, today we're introducing the landmark Children's Wellbeing Bill to enable all children to succeed, including young carers. That increased the pupil funding premium to over £2.9 billion, which can be used to support pupils with identified needs, and that, of course, includes carers. And now young carers are on the school census, as he knows, that's since 2023. They have greater visibility and schools will be better able to identify and support them. Mr. Speaker, he talks of singing. There was carols outside our front door on Monday, and my family was surprised to see the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, shamelessly plugging his song. We have strict rules about antisocial behaviour, but in the spirit of the season, I simply say Happy Christmas.
Sir Red David. Well, happy Christmas, Prime Minister. Can I thank him for allowing the Young Carers Choir to sing outside number 10? I hope he and the staff enjoyed it. Our song is called Love Is Enough, but the hard truth is, for many young carers and young adult carers, actually love is not enough. These amazing young people need real action to help them with the challenges they face. So in addition to the measures that the Prime Minister just talked about, will he support the Carers Trust's Young Carers Covenant to make sure across government, across local authorities, we are supporting these young people with all the support they deserve?
We should support these young people, and we continue to work across the sector to ensure all schools identify, support and record data on young carers. And of course, Mr. Speaker, we boosted the carers allowance in the budget, but I agree with him in relation to these young carers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister in wishing everyone a very happy Christmas this year? For many in my constituency and indeed across the country, particularly those in temporary accommodation, it won't be a happy Christmas. On the Tories' watch, temporary homelessness more than doubled. So what is the government doing to support families and children living in temporary accommodation, particularly this season?
Well, she's right about the appalling inheritance, which included record numbers sleeping rough, almost 160,000 children living in temporary accommodation. Speaker, we're delivering nearly £1 billion into councils to tackle homelessness, including increasing funding in Bolton over the next year. That includes dedicated support with housing, with mental health, and with employment. But we're also committed to tackling the root causes, and that's why we're building 1.5 million new homes and abolishing Section 21 no-fault eviction, something they said they were going to do and repeatedly failed to do.
Ben Lake. In 2022, the Prime Minister supported calls for fair and fast compensation for 1950s women impacted by the changes to the state pension. And yet, just yesterday, his government rejected those same calls out of hand. Mr. Speaker, is this what the Prime Minister meant when he promised to lead a government of change?
Mr. Speaker, this is a serious issue. Between 2005 and 2007, there were, I think, a 28-month delay in letters to women born in the 1950s about changes to pension age. That was unacceptable, and it was right that the government apologised for that. In 2011, the former Chancellor, George Osborne, then accelerated those changes with very little notice. That equally was unacceptable, and Labour opposed it at the time. It is a serious issue. It's a complex issue. The research, as he knows, shows that 90% of those impacted knew about the changes that were taking place. And I'm afraid to say the taxpayer simply can't afford the tens of billions of pounds in compensation when the evidence does show that 90% of those impacted did know about it. That's because of the state of our economy.
Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recent data shows that almost 11,000 Scots have been waiting for hospital treatment for over 2 years after referral. The equivalent number in England is around 113. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that this shows the catastrophic damage the SNP government have done to the Scottish NHS?
Well, he's right when he says the SNP is letting down patients in Scotland. As the Scottish Auditor General says, greater leadership is needed in the Scottish NHS. Waiting list targets are being missed. Spending on agency staff is skyrocketing. And delays to patient discharge are hitting record level. They seem to be proud of that appalling record. We've provided the money, they've got the powers, they've run out of excuses.
Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the summer, thousands of commuters using Harlington and Flitwick stations have had to put up with nearly 8% of trains being cancelled in the evening peak, and nearly a third of trains that do arrive are more than 5 minutes late. Is it a mere coincidence, Mr. Speaker, that such poor performance follows this government's decision to pay off their union backers with no strings attached?
The trains and all travel was in an appalling state under the last government. We're clearing that up and fixing it, and he should be welcoming that.
Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Parliamentary Ombudsman concluded that an injustice was done to 1950s born women. It ruled that they are owed compensation and that Parliament intervened to deliver justice. In my constituency of Liverpool, West Derby, I have more than 5,000 women affected. And alongside a great many members in this House, I believe these women are owed compensation for the injustice done to them at the hands of the state. So will the Prime Minister give members the opportunity to vote on whether they believe WASPI women are owed compensation?
Mr. Speaker, I've just set out the factual background. and the percentage that knew about the change. And the simple fact of the matter is, in the current economic circumstances, the taxpayer can't bear the burden of tens of billions of pounds in compensation. Well, they're chuntering away. In 14 years, they accelerated the changes and not once spoke about compensation.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents, Caroline and Savannah, are just two of thousands across Devon, Cornwall and beyond who are living with postural tachycardia syndrome and have been unable to access adequate treatment since the retirement of the only consultant available to work with them in July. What action can the Prime Minister take to help me secure the treatment that my constituents need, and will he agree to meet with me and them to discuss the treatment of POTS in more detail?
Well, I thank her for raising this important issue on behalf of her constituents. It does underline the critical importance of the NHS workforce plan that we will deliver next summer to ensure that the export workforce is in place to get the NHS back on its feet. I am proud that we're investing an additional £22.6 billion to fix our NHS, and I will, of course, make sure she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to deal with the issues of concern to her constituents.
Jodie Gosling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and a very Merry Christmas. May I associate myself with the comments of the Prime Minister and my gratitude to all of those that serve our communities over Christmas. I'd like to give special credit to foster carers in Nuneaton and across the UK for the incredibly important role that they play. We know that their care transforms lives, but the foster carers in Nuneaton tell me that there simply isn't the support that there used to be, and over 17% of children are waiting over 4 years for care. Recently, I was made aware of one child who had had 9 home placements before the end of Key Stage 1. Can the Prime Minister ensure that there will be a robust system to provide consistent and swift care when needed?
Well, I'm grateful to her for raising this issue because, Mr. Speaker, every single child deserves the best start in life, and there are far too many shocking cases of children being let down. The Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill is being introduced today, and that does put children's interests at the heart of government policy, and I hope it will be supported across the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour promised not to raise taxes on working people, but farmers are some of the hardest working people that I know. Peter Douglas from Jedburgh has looked at the details of this policy, and he says Labour's inheritance tax increase will prevent him passing on his family farm to his son and daughter. They say Labour have betrayed them. They can't trust the Prime Minister to keep his word. They've got a point, haven't they?
If he would kindly pass the details of the individual case he's raised to my team, we will look into it. As he knows, we put a record £5 billion into farming over the next 2 years in the budget. Just 2 weeks ago, £350 million was put in to support farmers. That contrasts with the £300 million underspend of the last government on farming. And in a typical case, the threshold is £3 million, which means that the vast majority of farmers will be unaffected. But I'll look into the individual case that he's raised with me.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently spoke to a man in Worksop whose son's arm was badly broken when he was knocked off his bicycle by an off-road biker speeding on the pavement. Dressed in black, no number plate, totally unidentifiable. The young boy no longer goes out to play. His experience isn't unique. What action is being taken to smash the bikes and put police back on our streets?
Well, I'm glad she's raised this because off-road bikes were a complete nuisance under the last government, got completely out of control. We're introducing new respect orders to crack down on off-road bikes, strengthening police powers in relation to dealing with this big problem that got out of control under the last government. We will also deliver 13,000 more neighbourhood police to ensure that we keep control of our streets, something that was lost under the last government.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead announced plans to hike council tax by an unprecedented 25%. This would require the government's permission. Does he agree with me that this outrageous request should be rejected, that the borough might be a candidate for accelerated local government reorganisation, and my constituents should not be footing the bill for the persistent weak financial control and political failure locally.
Well, thank him for raising this issue on behalf of his constituents. We are, as he knows, committed to fixing the foundations of local government and keeping taxes as low as possible for working people. The budget announced real terms increase for local government with over £4 billion of added funding. And so we will put that support in place, and he's right to raise this issue.
Speaker, please, Liz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have in our NHS many brilliant emigre and refugee surgeons from the greatly troubled Middle East. And I've been privileged to work alongside some of them, Iran, Iraq, and now, as we think, especially of Syria. What practical measures can the UK take to help ensure that Syria now has the best chance of becoming an open society and the second functional democracy in the region?
Well, I thank him for drawing attention to the people of Syria and to the health workers of all backgrounds who do vital work in our NHS. The fall of Assad's brutal regime is to be welcomed and should be welcomed, but we must be cautious about what comes next. We've provided £50 million of extra support to vulnerable Syrians, and I've spoken to G7 leaders to work towards a Syrian government that respects international law, universal human rights, and protects all citizens across all sectors. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dave Dugan.
Mr. Speaker, before the election, this Prime Minister said he would lower energy bills by £300. Since he took office, they've gone up by £149. He said he would protect the winter fuel payment, but now he's in power, he stripped it off our pensioners. And he said he lined up for many photos with WASPI women, saying he'd have their backs, and he's just betrayed them in the most scandalous way possible. This is now the defining characteristic of this one-trick phony Prime Minister who says one thing and does another. In Scotland, the SNP are 16 points ahead in the polls. Does he understand? Does he understand why the people of these islands, especially those of us in Scotland, treat him with such contempt?
They used to ask those questions. They used to ask those questions from this sort of area with very many MPs not so long ago. That all changed in July, and he's now carping from right up there. We can hardly hear him.
Debbie Abrahams. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry I couldn't hear you over the hubbub. First of all, can I wish you a very Merry Christmas, and all colleagues across the House a very Merry Christmas, and especially the House staff. And also, I associate myself with the remarks thanking emergency services and our armed forces for their service. Mr. Speaker, Christmas is a time for peace and goodwill. Given there are more conflicts now than at any time since World War II, and that all wars end with a peace, what is the Prime Minister's resolution to work with others for a more peaceful world in 2025?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank her for her question? And I'm sure colleagues across the House support the values of the Parliamentarians for Peace, which I know she is involved with, and their work to support human rights across the globe. And that is the sentiment, I think, that we take into this festive period. Thank you.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it was good to hear that the Prime Minister visited British soldiers in Estonia yesterday before they have to spend Christmas away from their families. We would all like to see a lasting peace emerge for Ukraine in the new year, but Putin may take any deal brokered by Trump as a break in which to re-equip and rearm. What will his government do to deter Russia from restarting its imperial war of aggression following any peace deal?
Well, can I congratulate him on his appointment to the Intelligence and Security Committee and thank him for raising the question of our troops in Estonia, who will be there over Christmas without their families, and they're right on the front line with a very clear sense of purpose as part of our NATO contingent, and we thank them. He's right that we must continue to support Ukraine, and that was the subject of our discussions in Estonia yesterday. Make sure Ukraine is put in the strongest possible position, whether negotiations or not, and be absolutely clear that this conflict could be ended straight away if the aggressor, Russia, backed off.
Mother of the House, Diane Abbott.
The WASPI women fought one of the most sustained and passionate campaigns for justice that I can remember, year in, year out. We did promise them that we would give them justice. I understand the issue about the cost, but does the Prime Minister really understand how let down WASPI women feel today?
I do understand the concern, of course I do. I set out the history, Mr. Speaker, but the research is clear that 90% of those impacted did know about the change. And in those circumstances, the taxpayer simply can't afford the burden of tens of billions of pounds of compensation. But I do understand the concerns.
Will Forster.
I know the Prime Minister is aware of the case of my constituent, Zara Sharif, who was brutally tortured and appallingly murdered by her father and her stepmother. I want Zara's legacy to be one where she's the last vulnerable child to be killed by people that should have looked after her. Will the Prime Minister ensure that an independent inquest and review is taken into Zara's death and it's held immediately in the new year so we can learn why public authorities failed, so we can ensure that it never happens again?
He rightly raises this absolutely harrowing case, and it is important that all the lessons are learned. There is an independent process going on, but we must be clear about overhauling children's social care to keep young people safe and looking again about the framework for homeschooling, amongst other things. So we need to learn those lessons. We are taking steps. There is a process going on at the moment, and I'll update the House in due course.
Alan Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We're going to leave Prime Minister's questions at this point. We will, of course, bring you any important developments as they come. Let me introduce our guest for this part of Politics Live. For the Government, Energy Minister Michael Shanks, Kevin Hollinrake for the Conservative Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, and the BBC's political editor Chris Mason. The final session of PMQs, it's gone fast, hasn't it, this term? Kemi Badenoch posing the questions to Keir Starmer broadly on the economy, particularly on the decision to cut winter fuel payment to millions of pensioners, and also about the budget. How do you think she's doing?
She has a really difficult job, doesn't she? I mean, it's a cliche to say it, but it's worth saying that being Leader of the Opposition is probably the toughest job in Westminster, and she's trying to pick her party up off the canvas of a colossal election defeat. And numerically, of course, Labour are overwhelmingly dominant in the Commons. But what I'm struck by is that the political debate seems much more competitive than the numbers suggest that it should. And I thought the exchanges today tapped into the central challenge for the government, which is that, as the last couple of years have proven under the Conservatives and Labour, governing in the 2020s is difficult for all of the reasons that we're well aware of. And the challenge that Keir Starmer is facing repeatedly, and we've seen the latest case study of it in the last 24 hours, is a charge that critics can put to him about hypocrisy, about saying something in opposition and doing something different in government. We've seen that with the response to the WASPI women and the government deciding that there won't be compensation. I have to acknowledge, I wasn't surprised that the government concluded it wouldn't compensate the WASPI women because of the nature of where the public finances are, because of the other pressures around compensation payments on
which is
the
what
post
the
office and on
yeah.
infected blood, which arguably are more egregious examples of state or institutional failure. But nonetheless, even though there's subtleties here, it wasn't in the Labour manifesto a promise to pay compensation, but there's all sorts of images that are very Googleable within a nanosecond.
And we've done quite a few of them.
Where senior figures from the Prime Minister down, the Deputy Prime Minister and others were making warm noises and standing behind colourful placards, which wouldn't have, which could have very easily implied to a campaigner that Labour were sympathetic and therefore they might be up for compensating.
Well, we're going to talk to one of the campaigners, in fact, a constituent of yours, Michael Shanks. But before we do, let's go back to the cut, the decision by the government, very early decision, to cut winter fuel payment to millions of pensioners. Can you explain to our viewers why it is right to defend that decision?
Well, I think on two fronts it was an important decision, but no doubt a difficult decision, and we've all wrestled with these difficult decisions in the first few months in government. But on two fronts. Firstly, of course, the inheritance that we had as a government meant that we had to make some quick and substantial decisions to make sure that we had the public finances on a stable footing.
But why was
so
cutting,
that we could have, for example,
cutting
in the
winter
budget,
fuel payment to millions of pensioners right? Why was it right? Make the case for it.
If I come on to the second point, it is one of the least targeted benefits. In fact, I think the least targeted benefits that we have as a country. And I had a number of constituents who came to me to say, well, actually, I'm quite glad because, do you know what, we've been donating it to charity for the past 15 years. Now, of course, there are people out there who will struggle at winter, and that's why we've been pushing around the uptake in pension credit. But there are a significant number of people for whom actually they didn't need this benefit. And in really tough financial times, where we have to target the limited money that government has at those who need it the most, to me, it absolutely is fair to say that the most vulnerable should be in receipt of government support, not those who can afford it.
Well, Kevin Hollingray, why is it right to have a universal benefit for pensioners in terms of winter fuel payments?
Because that's the simplest way to distribute this benefit. And Keir Starmer and Michael try to stand behind this thing, oh my God, really rich people shouldn't get it. Yeah. But the point is, you are taking off people who are on £11,500 a year. That cannot be right. Those people cannot get pension credit. And even people below that number, and I have 20,000 people in my constituency who will lose this benefit. Even people below that, many of them will not fill in this great big form to apply for pension credit. And that's what we're seeing. You're seeing a tiny take-up of those people. It is a terrible policy. It's your choice, Michael. It's Keir Starmer's choice. He cannot wriggle out of it on the basis of some phantom black hole in the finances.
So will the Conservatives, and should they pledge to reinstate that payment?
Listen, I am not here to make policy on the hoof.
And Kevin, you have just criticised.
Can I just say this? We would not have made that choice that they have made. No way.
Even you did in a previous manifesto, you said that you would means test the winter fuel payment. So, so you have in the past, with the 2017 manifesto, maybe the 2019 manifesto, I can't remember exactly. But you have in the past recognised, and actually you made the point yourself there, that should the super wealthy be in receipt of government?
Well, that's a different point.
I think it's the same point.
You're not excluding the super wealthy, Michael.
But you either recognise means testing or you don't.
You're excluding people on £11,500 a year or more. That's a disgrace. And people under that, many of them will not apply for pension credit.
And that's why,
it's utter disgrace.
At the same time, we've done what we can to increase incomes for pensioners, and also committed to the triple lock, which, of course, the Conservative Party has now said that there's.
Well, we'll come on to that. But just briefly, if it is such a disgrace, I sort of expect you and Conservatives to say we will reinstate it.
Well, I'm not going to write our manifesto at this point in time. That's not fair. But other than the point is, there's no way in the world that we would have withdrawn that benefit, at least without telling people we're going to do it in our manifesto. This is the con you're getting from Labour. Time and time again, whether it's WASPI, whether it's national insurance, whether it's fully funded, fully costed manifesto, all those things, you've seen promise after promise broken. That's what's wrong.
But Michael, the really interesting point on this is that every single one of those points is a legacy of 14 years of the previous government. We have had to clear up problem after problem after problem.
But
Michael, the election was called before.
You spent £70 billion a year. You had £70 billion a year more. Some in taxes, some in borrowing.
Kevin, you had all of this information. You had all of these problems.
You had the information.
You called an election and ran away.
But you yourself have just said in your first answer to me, Michael Shanks, that you do admit that many pensioners will struggle. They will suffer as a result of this cut, despite the fact that you point to the triple lock, the state pension going up, that you yourself admit that people will struggle as a result of cutting the winter fuel payment.
I think people is the important point here, not just older people. And so if we're going to target target support for people. That's why we've announced, for example, around warmer homes funding, around how we want to bring down energy bills for everybody. Actually, there are people in households right across the country that need support with their bills. At the moment, it was a hugely untargeted benefit. We want to increase the uptake of pension credit because, of course, under the previous government, there were tens of thousands of people entitled to it who didn't get it. And we've seen that number increase now of people who didn't know they were entitled to. We've now pushed through a campaign
and that may erode, of course, the amount of money you actually save. But you're a Scottish MP, and actually every pensioner household in Scotland will receive a winter fuel payment next year because that's what the Scottish Government has announced. So your constituents, many of them will. How uncomfortable is that for you?
Well, I think that's the nature of devolution, is that the Scottish Government's chosen to make a difference. And interestingly, not for this year, though. They chose to make it from next year, even though they've got the funding and the powers to do it from this year. But they've chosen to do that, and that's the nature of devolution. For 25 years, we've had parliaments in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, so they can make different choices. They've chosen to do that. But I would point out that the downside of that is that they're not investing in the NHS in the same way as we are in England, which has resulted in some of the worst.
Let's just stick with the winter fuel payments here.
Michael, I'm curious here as to what the underpinning of the justification is. Is it either a view that universal benefits are a bad idea because you're shoveling money in the direction of some people who don't need it? Or is it about saving money? Because if you are encouraging enough people to sign up for pension credit who are eligible to it, and I take the point that there's lots who are not signing up, then you start wiping out the savings. So I'm trying to get to the basis, the underpinning basis for why you've taken the decision that you have. Is it money saving, or is it a principle about universal benefits not being the right thing to do?
Well, I think in a time where the public finances are not in such a difficult state, you might look at universal benefits as the appropriate way to bring whole groups of people out of poverty, which is why Gordon Brown introduced it in the first Labour government, because pensioners were the biggest group of people living in poverty. That's not the case anymore, and the public finances are in an incredibly difficult position. So when public finances are so difficult, you narrow the focus to reach the most vulnerable.
All right, well, let Kevin respond and then we'll move on.
In such a terrible state, why did you settle the train drivers' dispute without negotiation? Why do you settle the doctors and nurses dispute without negotiation? Not even with some productivity improvements attached. Why do you do that, Michael? Well, it's a choice. Stand up for your choices.
I'm very happy to stand up for the choices. I think, to be fair, talking about strikes is a bit hypocritical from the previous government.
I wasn't talking about strikes, I was talking about pay settlements.
Yeah, but the pay settlements are a result of the fact that all of those groups of people you've just spoken about were on strike throughout the last government, not delivering the service that was necessary. And when we want to see economic growth, it's important people can actually get to their work and they're not constantly caught in train strikes. And it's important that our NHS deals with the backlog we inherited by getting people back to work.
Blair and Brown would never settle that pay claim at that level.
I have no problem defending the fact that people who hold our public services together should be paid well for doing so.
We're going to talk about the decision taken by the Labour government yesterday, and that's not to pay compensation to WASPI women. It refers to the campaign group, which stands for Women Against State Pension Inequality. And it represents women in the 1950s who were affected by changes to the state pension age, moving it from 60 to 65. The WASPI Women Campaign Group agree with that equalisation, but says the affected women were not given sufficient warning or communication about the change and they should be compensated. Let's introduce Anne Potter, coordinator for WASPI Women Glasgow. Anne, we showed a picture of you earlier in the programme today, and we can show it again, pictured alongside Keir Starmer in 2022. You managed to persuade him to sign a pledge for fair and fast compensation. What do you make of the decision by the government yesterday?
It's absolutely shocking and unexpected. I'm absolutely disgusted with the whole situation, and it was really a slap in the face.
What do you say to that, Michael Shanks? Anne is also your constituent.
Look, Anne and I have had, half a dozen conversations about this issue since I was elected last year. She's always been very forthright with her views, but I've also been forthright in saying from the very beginning of my conversation with Anne that I don't think a universal compensation system was fair. And partly that is, look, this is an incredibly difficult decision, but we have to remember that, first of all, it's based entirely on the administration point that the Ombudsman picked up, that actually there were a group of women in the 1950s who should have been given letters when the pension age was, equalisation was sped up, that didn't happen, and we've apologised for that. And the Secretary of State was very clear on behalf of the government and the previous governments for apologising for that and to learn from that mistake in the future.
Right.
But what it also showed was 90% of women did know about this change. And there'll be disagreement about the figures, but I think Anne and I have also had the conversation where she acknowledged that a lot of women did know about it. And therefore, to come up with a sort of flat compensation fee that would total more than £10 billion is not a good use of public money at this time. Now, that's not to say that we don't recognise there was real maladministration and apologise for doing that. And I've said that to Anne on a number of occasions and to other WASPI
but do you
women.
recognise the sense of betrayal?
Forward.
We can show another image of you there with Anne, also holding a pledge about trying to resolve this issue fairly. Can you understand why Anne is disgusted? You've just gone against what you all, Labour politicians, many of whom now in Cabinet, campaigned to compensate them, and now you're not.
Well, of course I can understand that, and of course people are going to be frustrated when they think there's going to be one outcome and there is another, and of course for a lot of WASPI women, and I do think there's a real spectrum here of how affected some women were by this. Of course there'll be disappointment, and I recognise that. But we also have to balance that against what the best use of public money is in really difficult times, but also recognising that this isn't about compensation for the equalisation of pension age. This is about what the Ombudsman very clearly set out was the maladministration of not sending letters. And I don't think £10 billion to compensate for that is the best use of public funds.
Anne, do you accept that?
I do not accept that, I'm afraid. And Michael knows my views pretty well. And I think I have to go back to the actual report that the Ombudsman produced in March. And it was quite clear that they said that finite resources should not be used in preventing them from failing to pay out our compensation. And that's quite honestly what I can hear from the Labour Party at the moment. Because every time they talk about it, they don't have the finance to deal with it.
Anne, hello, it's Chris Mason here, the BBC's political editor. It's nice to talk to you and thanks for coming on the programme. I wonder, as you reflect back over the last couple of years and those photos that you had taken alongside senior Labour politicians, where it leaves your feeling about politics in general and politicians and their capacity to be, well, bluntly, to be believed.
It's a very, very difficult situation I find myself in, because I have put a lot of faith in my politicians. We've had a lot of support from parties, in Labour, Conservative, Greens, SNP, Tories. We've had lots of support. I have to say I am so disappointed in this current Labour Party, because they led us up the garden path. They gave us the information that, oh yes, we're going to support you. They signed our pledges, they showed interest. And at the end of the day, when I heard that announcement yesterday, which came out of the blue, I was absolutely flabbergasted.
And what impact has increasing the pension age had on you and your life?
Well, I made decisions way back in 2007. I had a job and I got the opportunity to leave that job, and I was approaching age 53. My employers had a pension scheme, so I knew I was getting my pension at age 60, which was to coincide with my state pension at age 60. So my decisions were based on the fact that I was going to have my pension at age 60, and that was way back in 2007. And I'm not silly. I'm insulted by the suggestion that women like us don't read letters or don't understand what's happening. I'm financially astute. I am quite aware of politics, and I certainly would not have missed anything like a big change in my state pension age. And to suggest that a lot of us have been hiding our head or burying our head in the sands is an absolute nonsense.
Michael, what do you say in response?
Well, Anne and I have talked about this, and I've always said I don't suggest for a second that the women affected by this were somehow just not reading letters, but the Ombudsman's report was very clear that actually a significant number of the women, 90%, but it may or may not be that figure, but certainly a significant number of women did know that this change was coming. And look, there's definitely more the government could have done. We've accepted that and we've apologised for that, and there's more that governments afterwards could have done. we did, I think, challenge a lot of the coalition government's decision to speed up that process towards equalisation, and that was where a lot of people joined the WASPI campaign, because of course the Labour Party did oppose those changes at the time, but that happened. And what we've now got to do is work out, well, what is the appropriate redress for that? We've apologised on the basis that the government, the maladministration of sending out letters when they should have been sent out wasn't done, and we've apologised for that. But I think the question of compensation comes down to, and it isn't just about the money, although every penny of public money we have to account for carefully. It's about the fact that £10.5 billion of compensation, when we don't have absolute certainty that all of those WASPI women were affected in the same way, when the degree of impact is completely different for all of those cases, that actually creating a system where we were looking at every case individually would have been hugely complex and cumbersome. The reality is we've reached this decision on balance. And look, I recognise it's a very difficult decision, and Anne and I will talk about this, I have no doubt, much more, and very happy to. But it's, I think, the right decision given the circumstances.
You've quoted the figure, the Ombudsman's figure, that 90%, it's echoed by Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, too, that the majority of women affected did know and were aware of the changes. Do you think the 10%, let's say it is 10%, who didn't, including Anne, should be compensated?
Well, I think the challenge is that what the Ombudsman also highlighted was that there is always a challenge reaching every single person on every change to processes. Now, we hope that that is easier in today's world of having multiple ways to communicate than it was where letters were the only way. But there are always groups where it's harder to reach than others. I don't think we can compensate people because every single government decision will affect people in different ways. We would be compensating people till the ends of time.
Well, Kevin, if you were in government now, would you be compensating Anne and others from the WASPI Women's Campaign?
I don't know. That's not the point, I don't think, in this at all. What's wrong here, and Anne sounds like a very reasonable and articulate person, what's wrong here is she was promised by Michael, to some extent at least, by the Prime Minister, by the Home Secretary, by the Deputy Prime Minister, by the Working Pension Secretary Liz Kendall, all those people promised they would compensate.
Yeah, but the thing is, you would like to be in government, and you have been extremely involved and at the very centre, really, of compensation, for example, in the post office scandal. Do you equate this historic injustice, as the WASPI women present it, in the same way to get £10.5 billion of compensation?
Well, no, I don't. I'm sorry to say that, and that'll disappoint you. No, I don't, because what the Ombudsman report clearly said, there was not financial loss. Now, people will argue that, but that's what the Ombudsman said, where clearly we have seen in the post office scandal huge financial loss and massive other detriment to those people. So I think we've got to look at every single situation in its own right.
All right. Well, let me just get Anne to respond to that. Listening to what Kevin Hollingray said, he doesn't, with all due respect, paraphrasing his words slightly, but he doesn't equate it in the same way as the post office scandal. Do you agree?
Well, technically it's not. I mean, we weren't affected to the same extent. In different ways we were affected. But I still think that when the Ombudsman has made a decision and they find that there has been definite maladministration, then what's the point of having an Ombudsman in the first place? Because we went through a huge process, or a long process, to get to that stage, with the belief that the Ombudsman would look at this independently and would give us an honest answer on how we'd been treated.
Right.
And I think when it comes to the Ombudsman, I would be wondering why did I go to all the bother over the 6 years of doing an Ombudsman's report, producing it, and the government's just going to rip it up and put it in the bin.
Has it resulted in hardship for you, Anne?
Well, it has to a certain extent, because I had to continue working. I mean, I left that job I had in 2007, so I carried on. Well, I had to keep working after that, but it was more to do with I've been financially independent all my life, and I certainly didn't want to end up relying on any other benefits or anything at all. So I did end up working, but I'm more concerned about some of the ladies that I have in my group who have got nothing to live on. And although Michael and I have had this discussion on numerous occasions. He still thinks that there's still too many wealthy pensioners, and I have still to believe that I've got any wealthy pensioners in my group.
Well, Michael, is that what you believe? There are too many wealthy
I
pensioners?
don't think there are too many wealthy pensioners. I think the question that I've raised before is about whether the government should be providing universal benefits to some of those groups of people. That's the real question. But I think Anne touches on a really important issue about this debate about the WASPI women, I think, has been confused over the past few years into two different issues. One is the women who want compensation for the equalisation for 5 years of lost pensions, and there's another group who want the compensation for the maladministration, and that's the point that the Ombudsman was reporting on.
Anne Potter, thank you very much for joining us today from the WASPI Women, get it the right way round, in Glasgow. Chris, just before we go, just briefly, by the way, Diane Abbott, Mother of the House, Labour MP, intervened in quite a pointed way about the Prime Minister. Labour unhappiness with this decision?
Yeah, I think there's two things here. I don't think there was much expectation from many Labour MPs that this was going to be compensation that would be paid for all the reasons that we've discussed as far as the public finances are concerned and the other compensation packages that are being paid. But it's back to that point about hypocrisy, which is just really, really stinging, I think. And for Labour MPs, many of whom, hundreds of whom, are new, adjusting to the reality of an inbox that reflects that you're in a party of government rather than a party of opposition, with all the tough decisions that brings along.
Before Prime Minister's questions, we were talking about Elon Musk and discussions and negotiations going on with Reform UK, Nigel Farage, about a donation. You've written a piece, Chris Mason, The Challenge of Disruptors with Deep Pockets.
Blimey. Quite a start when you see that headline.
You know your name, Chris Mason, as I reminded you of it there.
Can't deny it, that's me, yeah.
What did you make of, and what do you make of this debate around a donation, which of course can't come from him as an individual, but might be able to through a vehicle here?
2 points. So Nigel Farage is the master of political storytelling and intrigue. So what we got yesterday was some very newsworthy pictures. He did not come back with his wads, his sort of suit pocket full of wads of Wonga, but he teased that there might be something coming. The big picture philosophical point, if you like, is the extent to which we as a country are comfortable or not with rich folk from overseas having a big role in our politics. Miriam Cates, one of Kevin's former colleagues, former Conservative MP, posed the thought as a thought experiment. If you come to a view about Elon Musk and Nigel Farage, is that because you might have a view about them as two people? What about if it was Bill Gates and Keir Starmer? In other words, detach the individuals and pose the question about the role of rich folk abroad in our politics and whether it is legitimate or not. And that is a big question, particularly in the context of Mr. Musk, because A, he is super wealthy, and B, he is more than willing to offer a view in public, and C, he's more than willing to offer money in the direction of political outfits that he is supportive of. So it's a big old challenge coming in the new year. The government has said...
Well, they've said they are going to look at donations.
But critics of the government will say, are you not trying to change the rules to service your own ends? So it's a big debate.
Something to discuss in the new year. That's all we have time for today. I'll be back tomorrow with the final Politics Live of the year. Can you believe it? Thank you very much to our guests for joining me here today. And I'll be back at 12:15 tomorrow on BBC Two and on the iPlayer. Until then, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.